So, as I said before, there's some note cards and some pencils floating around. So, hopefully, something has conjured up a question in your mind that you want to ask. So, while they're responding to this next question, you can write down your question. Write if it's for someone specific or for anyone in the group to respond to, and then I'll come around and collect them towards the end here. Um, but now that they've kind of each had a chance to give us a feel for what informs our religious identity, our spiritual identity. Um, Now, question number 2 talks to how that interacts with the other pieces of our identity, and they've begun to touch on that a little bit, but they'll explore that a little bit more now. So, speaking to the experience of those within your faith community, what points of intersection exist between your religious identity and your other identities? Do people in your faith tradition ever experience tension between different aspects of their religion, their culture, and/or their nationalism? In other words, is it ever hard to be religious and American, religious and modern, religious and from your particular culture? And then what is the source of that tension or conflict?
Thank you very much. I just want to add one before I give a response to this question. From from what you said, I think I think we'll all agree on this. Identity is very precious, and we identities identity is one way in which we celebrate who we are in multiple ways. I think where identity really gets very difficult and very problematic is when I is when any one of us, when we profess an identity that that requires the devaluation of someone else, whatever that identity will be. If I claim a Hindu identity, but in describing that identity and in affirming it, everyone who is not Hindu is in some way of diminished value in my eyes, then my identity has the possibility of becoming oppressive uh, to the other. I think that's why we have to be really careful about identity. So I can celebrate being American, but if being American means everyone who is not American is somehow lesser in dignity or value in my eyes, then my my identity can become take a violent and oppressive uh, turn. Because what we see, given all the common ways in which we have spoken, I think what we see when we look at human history is that whenever one community, whether it's a religious community, an ethnic community, an economic community, or political community, whenever it wants to create a case for oppressing others and even making efforts to exterminate the other, there is always the first step of saying, of distinguishing yourself from the other, distinguishing your identity from the other, to say the other is not like me. We don't share anything with them. We don't have anything in common. They are different. They are completely other. And therefore, it's we legitimize the ability then to destroy. Because we can't destroy those in whom we see ourselves, or those in whom we see that which we value, like the divine image. So we'll have to say the divine image is not in that one. They don't have a soul, or they are not human in the same way like us. And then our identity becomes the occasion then that legitimizes the destruction of the other. So we always have to be critical of the way in which we profess identity, because as you said, identity is always in relation to someone else. It's not simply saying who I am, but it's also saying who the other is. Every definition of identity is about self and is about other also. And I think, with religion, we can also ask ourselves an important question about all of our religious traditions, including my own Hindu tradition. who is the negativized other? Either the negativized internal other or the negativized external other in relation to whom I have defined myself. That negativized other could be a polytheist, that somehow my tradition legitimizes me to hate. Right? Who is the negativized other in relation to which I am affirming my identity? Who have I negativized in history? It could be for me, it could be the lower caste Hindu. If I claim upper caste status, I am negativizing, I am professing identity that is dependent on the lesser worth of another. And religion has been a part of that. We have to own that. Something just to add on the second question. I think the Hindu community as a whole is a very young community here in the United States, because the community historically only took roots in the late 1960s when the immigration law was changed and under the JFK administration, which made it possible for people of Asian origin to become US citizens. Before that, you had the Asian Exclusion Act and all of that, which didn't allow someone coming from Asia to become a US citizen. So only in the late 1960s, when the new immigration law was brought forth by President Kennedy. He was assassinated, but President Johnson saw it through. Many young Hindus who were here in graduate programs in the United States decided to stay here. So we're looking at a community that's already about 50 years in in effect, and now we have the first generation born of Hindus born in the United States. Like my kids would belong to that generation, first American-born Hindu generation. And I think I want to identify one challenge, and maybe you see how my friends will think about it. I think the challenge is a common one in many ways, and perhaps there may be some areas of difference. I put it in this way. The Hindu tradition, for most of its history, never really made a distinction between religion and culture. In India, culture was very much infused with religion. So much so that you didn't really have intentional agencies that were necessary for the transmission of religion. You learned what it meant to be religious by growing up in a community that was saturated in its festivals, in its eating habits, in its arts, and its music, and its literature, rich with religion. So a child knew what it meant to be Hindu by the process of growing up in in a culture in which religion and culture were not um, separate. Now, in the United States, in a very significant way historically, and I know you would say that he was experiencing the same thing, but a new generation of Hindus are growing up in a culture in which the Hindu tradition is not reflected in any broader sense. There's no cultural reflection of of the Hindu tradition. So for the first time, I mean, Hindus are growing up in a largely non-Hindu cultural context. So it really raises a question that we're struggling with. What does it mean to be Hindu? What is the public Hindu identity? I mean, we're already living in a culture where religion is marginalized, and already religion has now become, in so many ways, compartmentalized in modern culture, because so many other compartments of our lives seem to be not connected intimately with our religious sensibilities and our religious visions. So that, is it possible for a religious tradition to thrive and to be creative when it really comes alive only in the home setting or only in the temple setting, and has no public face and no public life as it would have had, for for most of its history. That, the sphere of religion is even narrowing. Already secularization has affected all of it, but it's particularly acute in the case of the Hindu tradition. So, you know, I say to young Hindus with whom I discuss this, and I think that's where we are going to see perhaps a different way of being Hindu in the United States for them, in the sense that they have to think of the Hindu tradition. Yes, it has its life in the temple, in the Hindu temple, and in the home, but they will have to work harder at finding what are the core values of this Hindu tradition. What are its values? And how do I bring those values to express myself in my workplace? So let's say, I guess, given an example, say a non-violence is a central ethical teaching of the Hindu tradition, ahimsa. Okay, so what's the significance of ahimsa, in my workplace? If I am becoming politically active, how do I advocate for non-violence in public policy, in international relations? This is the way I can bring perhaps something that is very special from my religious heritage to the world in which I live. So by finding core values and on the basis of those core values, engaging the larger community in sharing, in debates, public policy debates that are taking place here in the United States, whatever those debates are, whether they're about sexual identity, whether they're about equality and inequality, whether about the distribution of economic resources. I think that there is an important place for religious voices to be heard in all of their diversity. This is where they can find dialogue. Young Hindus and young Muslims can talk about justice. What is the Hindu understanding of justice, which is a relevant value to our lives, about human equality, about race, about gender issues, so that we'll have to break through those efforts to compartmentalize religion and to ensure that religion becomes a larger mode of involvement and participation in the communities in which we live.
So just taking some notes. I think the first point for me to point out is that the Muslim community around the world is not a monolithic community. I mean, Muslims differ very much, just like Christians differ throughout the spectrum. A lot of times, I think, um, I know there are a lot of books written about the problem with Islam, the problem with Christianity, the problem with Judaism, the problem with Hinduism, and so on. I think the problem with all these things, the problem with all religions, is that it's practiced by humans, right? And as humans, by definition, we are flawed, flawed creation. We have desires, we have needs, we have wants. There's greed, there's hormones, there's superiority complexes, all these things. So as humans, this causes all these problems for us. And sometimes for a lot of people, and this being human overshadows, for our, I can speak for Muslims, being human overshadows their Islam for them, their submission to God for them, and that causes a lot of problems for those things. But I think, and also talking about the American Muslim identity, about a third of the Muslims in this country are converts. About a third, one third of the Muslim population, somewhere between 6 to 7 million Muslims, about a third are converts. So they, I think for most of them, they probably have less of a problem with any kind of conflict with the society, which they probably would have different ways. Like, maybe they have conflicts with their families not being happy they are Muslims and so on. But that's different than somebody who's an immigrant, because immigrants by themselves, there is a conflict of being an immigrant, trying to learn a new culture, get adjusted, and start adapting a new culture, new ways, and how you do go about things. So that's definitely there. But what I'm seeing more and more is that uh, there's a new phenomenon, new American Muslim culture which is growing in this country, which is really not a Pakistani culture. This is not an Arab culture. This is not a Afghani culture or Middle Eastern culture. It's very much genuinely American Muslim culture. The kids who are actually, we shouldn't call them the kids, but the teens and tweens who are growing up here, that they're born here, they're raised here, they have a new culture which is grown, which is very different than the culture that the parents came from, that the parents start practicing from. So I'm kind of like in a one leg on each side, because I was an immigrant, of course. I came in my late teen years, so I have that experience. But nonetheless, when my kids are growing up here, they are very much grown up with an American Muslim culture. So they have an American part of their culture and also a Muslim part of their culture, which is, they're not in. Sometimes, they're learning Arabic, and the Arabic teacher asks them, "So where are you from?" Well, they have to say, "Well, they say, "Oh, I'm from Afghanistan." And I ask my son, "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Afghanistan." No, no, you're not from Afghanistan. I was from Afghanistan, right? You're American. You don't know the Afghani culture. You hardly can speak the Afghani language. Why do you have to say from Afghanistan? So I think they're very much American Muslims who are growing up here. And now the question is, can you be a Muslim and American? I think the same question can be asked: can you be a Christian and an American? Can you be a Jew and an American? Can you be a Catholic and American? Can you be a Hindu and American? Right. So that's always the question. Or also the question is, can you be a Muslim and American? Is can you be an Egyptian and American? Can you be a Pakistani and American? Can you be an Afghani American? The question is, so which which one is more important to you? Or even as somebody who's maybe not religious, if you come to a point that, let's say, you have certain values that you hold dear, that you consider to be sacred or holy, but there are the things which are pushing you to against that. Which one do you hold more, right? Let's say if you have a religious value that says you should not kill people, and if you're being forced by a government that you have to go and bomb someplace, which would you take first, right? And I think, I had read a poll on evangelical Christians. They had asked the same questions from Muslims and also evangelical Christians. Which one are you first? Are you a Christian first or American first? Are you a Muslim first and American first? I think more evangelical answered saying that we are more Christian first than Americans and Muslims did, right? So there's definitely identities. The question is, which one has a higher priority in your life, right? So is there conflict? I would say there is less conflict in America than there is in many, many other places, especially, including some of the Muslim majority parts of the world. I think I can be a better, uh, more practice Islam better and purely in America than I can in a lot of Muslim countries, because in a lot of Muslim countries, that is like, my colleague was mentioning here, is that the religion is part of the culture, right? And a lot of culture isn't grown into religion. Culture is influencing religion, and the question is, and those certain cultural practices are not part of the religion. Now, if you don't follow those cultures, people look down upon you, right? Whereas in America, you don't have to follow any of those things. So as Muslims, I think Muslims can practice Islam much better in America than they can other places. Now, is that difficult? Of course it's difficult, right? But it is much easier today than it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. We have Muslims, I think the first mosques were built in or like early 1900s or late 1800s in America. Right? We have some mosques. We had some Muslims. We have historical documents that Muslims were here in North Dakota, South Dakota, and 1890. There are some Muslim merchants who were here as early as 1990. So, is that much easier now than it was then? Of course. I mean, I came here about 23 years ago. Things have become much easier for Muslims today than it was 20 years ago. Now Muslims can go and could have Muslim finances for their houses, non-interest based finances for their houses. That they can buy a house without having to deal with interest, with usury, which is forbidden in Islam, as it is, I'm sure, as Christianity and Judaism. There are Islamic schools. People can send their children. They can go to Islamic schools and learn the religion. There's mosques almost, and there are about 50 mosques around the cities, by the way, if you didn't know. We have mosques in cities like Winona, Mankato, Duluth, there's many other larger cities in Minnesota. Is that difficult when you go to work, like in December days like this, that I have to pray 3 prayers during the workday? Is that a challenge? Of course, it's a challenge, right? Like when the days are short, the sun sets at 4:30, and if I'm at work, I have to pray the noon prayer, the afternoon prayer, and the evening prayer at work. Is that a challenge in a society which seems like, at least, that it's moving more towards secularism, more towards, in some areas, anti-religion? Is that more difficult than a challenge? Yes, it is. But is it easier than it was long in many other times? Of course. So overall, I think it's very positive. I think people are very accepting. I think the vast majority of Minnesotans have been very accepting. So things are looking much better. Is there a conflict? There are difficulties? Yes, of course. And Muslims consider this to be part of the challenge. That Muslims believe that God created us, God is testing us through these situations in life. Are we able to overcome our greeds? Are we able to overcome those human challenges that God has given us? So which one, So I think the Muslims definitely believe it's a part of that. Um, the other part was the intersection between my religion and other religions. I think we, at least being people of faith, we have a lot in common with people who believe in God, right? I mean, I think the last statistics I read about America was that about 90% of people believe in God, believe in a deity and a creator of the universe. So I think we have that in common. And I think definitely Islam teaches us to have respect for the humanity. There's a very nice tradition from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that which, by the way, Prophet Muhammad um, taught in a very multi-faith environment. At a time when he was teaching Islam, they were Christians, they were Jews, they were the polytheists of that time. They were all around that area, and he was not telling people that you have to go and start attacking and killing these people. There was one instance, by the way, that he was actually teaching. He was in Medina. He was teaching his companions. They were sitting outside, and a funeral passed by. A funeral procession passed by. So, in respect of the funeral, he stood up and there other people were sitting. So they start tucking on his clothes and saying, "Sit down, O Messenger of God. This is a Jewish funeral." And Prophet Muhammad said, "Isn't it a human soul going back to his Lord? Isn't it a human soul going back to his Lord?" Showing that he had respect for the humanity regardless of the religion of people, right? There's that utmost respect for the human life which has to exist for the humanity, which is definitely part of the teachings of Islam. Is that a challenge? Sometimes, a couple of weeks ago we were at the Mall of America. It was time for the prayer for me. I had to stop by somewhere and pray. Right? Is that a challenge for people looking at me? That was that on my mind that people might be looking at me, knowing that they'd be wondering what's going on here, what should be worried or not, and all these cameras of the mall security turning on me. Is that there? Of course, I was, it was in the back of my mind. But my point was, well, I believe that God says it's time for me to pray. I had to submit my will to the will of God, which is that's essentially what Islam is: submission of your will to the will of God. And I had to go pray, right? And that was part of it. So is it a challenge? Yes. Is it becoming much easier? Absolutely. Um, uh, you know, am I really glad to be an American Muslim? Yes, absolutely. So.
Not too long ago, my friend and I were watching a football game and NFL, and before the game, they had, as is custom at sometimes, I don't know why at certain times, but certain games, uh, planes fly over the stadium, like Air Force jets. And I said to him, we're being indoctrinated and enculturated. Why are there jets flying over a football game? Why do we stand and pledge allegiance and sing the national anthem at a sporting event? This culture, it depends on the conflict depends on what part of the culture we're talking about for me. And Christians have looked at it on a spectrum of this relationship between identity and culture. On one extreme, for example, as I mentioned to you, the Amish, just the clear line of differentiation. We're separating ourselves. We're going to cloister together. We're going to educate our own children. We are not going to participate in the broader American culture. The other side of the spectrum is, on the other end, a Christian community or a Christian identity that says it is our responsibility to transform culture, to change culture, to organize and to use power. Power is only the ability to act. It's not negative, but the ability to act, to organize around those virtues and values of our faith, and say that there are elements in culture that need to be changed. I.e., for example, in Jesus' time, he said that the religious institution embodied in the temple of his time had to be destroyed. He said, not one stone will be left standing on top of each other. In other words, that part of the identity as a student of a way of life is to challenge the elements and to change and to work together to change elements of culture that we deem as inhumane, unjust, wrong. Because culture is not only all the beautiful vegetables and fruits that I can get at Lund's. Culture is not, or the creation is not just all the beautiful colors of the shapes of the birds that I like to feed. But there is also, I think we would all agree, something drastically amiss. All we have to do is read the news every day and watch the news or examine the shadows side of our own lives to know that the nature of sin, death, and darkness is real in the world. And so the conflict is for some Christians, they just say, well, the way we're going to deal with this is separate out. The others are going to say, well, we're going to organize and work together to change it. We're going to elect certain people. We're going to use political means. We're going to march. We're going to fight to bring about change, because that sin, death, and darkness becomes institutionalized and systematized and structuralized, i.e., Nelson Mandela on the wall is an example of a man who grew up in a society that needed to be changed. And so for Christians, there should be always a sense of conflict, because the creation is not all that it is God created it to be, is a core Christian belief. Now, somewhere on that spectrum is another element of the Christian identity that says, there's no conflict really, because Christianity is really just about me and God. And it's become this very individual, introspective Western conscience that defines Christianity. And so we have this very vertical dimension of our relationship with the ultimate creator, but we don't really value this horizontal dimension as a core piece of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so, therefore, some Christians have no conflict whatsoever. Some Christians can drive whatever car they can afford, but other Christians would say, can't do that. Some Christians would say, my discipleship is as close as the label on my shirt, because I can't be ignorant to where that fabric and that shirt was made, and the person that made it, and what they were paid, and the working conditions. And so the nature of conflict is in all depends on how you want to see. So for me, I went this afternoon to get some cookies so we could have a few little cookies after, and I went to Sam's Club. Now, there are some Christians that I hold very high in my opinion. That's the last place in the world they'd ever step their foot. Not because they think it's a bad company, it's because of their identity, how they see the teachings of Jesus manifested in his life. So we use words like Jesus, but we all have different ideas of what that is. He's an interpreted figure. And that's the value of gathering together, right? We learn from one another. We study texts that we hold as authoritative. We read stories. We do have the parties and the celebrations and the culture and all of that kind of stuff. We light candles and we sing songs and we eat foods. But ultimately, the prophetic traditions are thrown into the blender and it all comes out in a little cup to walk humbly, to love mercy, and to do justice. If you do those things, you might end up on a cross. That's our tradition. A lot of Christians can't even answer the question, why did the Roman Empire kill this guy? There had to have been some serious conflict. And so I think for us as Christians, that's one of those growing things that we just have to at least talk about. Because I'm inspired by the truth that the scripture says usury against a brother or sister is forbidden. How many Christians do you think practice that? See, so the truth of the matter is we pick and choose. We pick and choose. Jesus ultimately said that you take those three prophetic traditions, humility, mercy, justice, and it all ends up being the embrace and welcome of the other in an ethic of love. That is tough to do, but that's the call. And so is there conflict for me as an American and as a Christian? Depends on what you mean by American, what parts of American culture. I love my iPhone. I have no conflict. There are Christians who go to jail because they will not let their tax dollars go towards the military industrial complex. So it all depends on how radical you think Jesus was and how you answer the question, how we answer the question as Christians. Why did he end up on a tree? That's the nature of our conflict, answering that question.
This was much harder than I thought it would be to pick a question, so I apologize if I don't ask your question. But I'm going to try and get through a couple of these because a couple of them were quick and they were directed at one panelist, so we'll start with those. So first for Dr. Rambachan, this is just someone wanting to clear up maybe some of their ignorance that you identified as kind of our human condition. And that is just, what is the holy book for Hinduism and who wrote it? And you mentioned that there's divine in every person. And so does this equate to all of us being God in some way, or how would you define that? And hopefully maybe make it a couple minutes.
Yes. So we can get more questions. I'll just try to be very, very brief. There are many, because India is a subcontinent and it's a place of great diversity and multiplicity. There are many sacred texts that Hindus look to. But I think if I have to identify the one text that all Hindus will consider to be authoritative, it will be the text we speak of as the Veda. The Veda. And the Vedas are understood as revelation from God. The Vedas are called in Sanskrit Sruti, which means that which was heard. The words that were heard from the divine. Second, it would be too simplistic to say that the Hindu tradition teaches that we are God in that literal way. After all, I am not omniscient. I am not omnipotent. So it would be really wrong and idolatrous in some ways and sacrilegious to say that a finite human being is God in this simple way. But because God is infinite and because God is not limited by time and space, and as I said, God is present equally and identically in all beings, at the most fundamental level of my God is present in me and with me, and with everyone else. We can't live outside of God. We all exist in the divine. I love, for me, it speaks very much to what the Hindu tradition teaches. The text that in God we live and move and have our being. That's very Hindu. In God we live and move and have our being. We live and move and have our being. You can't move outside of God. You can't live outside of God. So in that sense, one would want to speak about the divine reality, the divine presence, which intersects with it at the most fundamental level with everything and everyone.
Now, this is actually a question for everyone. Um, do you find Christians who are evangelical or who are missiological or missionary focused in their stance towards other religions to be oppressive? Um, how is a Christian to take serious what a call to missions or a call to conversion? How is a Christian to take that seriously, yet also honor and respect those of other faiths and religions? So, anyone who wants to tackle that?
Not anymore. Well, let me tell you my story. My story is when I came at a young age and I went to high school, right? And I knew enough about my religion, but I was a teenager. But I grew up in a relatively religious family, which at that point, which the communists ruled Afghanistan, we were probably more religious than most people in our neighborhood. But nonetheless, we were not from a very clerical family. But nonetheless, I had some knowledge of my religion. So when I came, I had studied some religion and things, and religion was part of what they taught, well, like one of the subjects in Afghanistan that the school taught, which has always been the case. So I knew something about religion. When I came to America here in school, I had like literally within the first month that I set foot on school and a high school here, I had like a dozen people trying to convert me to Christianity, and they would always give me all these booklets that I had to read and the Bibles I had to read and all these things. And at first I really I was really I really hated that thing that I had to go back and respond to them. And then when I said, okay, let me start reading those things. And I started reading to them and had discussions with them and things like that. And so then I got to the point of telling them, came to the point of saying them why I could not be a Christian based on what they were teaching me. Based on what the Bible was teaching, based on what belief they were believing about the why I could not be a Christian. So I mean, in the beginning, I think this is very common for a lot of Muslims. And by the way, I don't consider it to be wrong for Christians because they believe this is something true that they believe in. They believe this leads them to heaven, and they try to share it with others. Which in reality, I don't think it's it's not a bad thing for them to want the eternal good for the rest of the humanity. But nonetheless, Muslims believe the same way. So I think it's a good thing for them to come and have a discussion with Muslims so we can tell them, why we believe that Islam is that way to really lead to heaven. So I think it's a good discussion. So I don't mind it anymore. And I usually tell my Muslim friends, if people come to you, do not get upset. Don't call the police on them. Have a nice discussion with them, nice chat with them, and tell them what Islam is truly about versus what they may have heard through the news what Islam might be about. Because I usually tell people that if I only knew about Islam from what I hear in the news, I would be scared of Muslims too, right? Because I mean, in the news by definition, they show you the worst of the worst of any community. No, I don't mind them at all. So we actually had last Sunday we had a great discussion at the Islamic Center about Jesus, peace be upon him, about the birth of Jesus, and we talked about different parts. The month before we had a discussion on are you sure you're going to heaven? I thought that was a really good discussion. Are you sure you're going to heaven? And talking about what the Quran says, what the Bible says, and then both sides we had really good discussions. And I think the point of the matter being that we agree in a lot and we differ on certain points. Just some, we have the person who was the chair for the discussion, Bon Clayton. He thinks he has read the Quran. He said like 66 times, and he has been reading the Bible a lot. He said we agree on 99%, we differ on 1%, which I think that's the point to focus on. We agree on a lot with our Christian friends than we disagree on. So I think it's better to focus on the 90%, 95%, 99%, whatever you consider it, than to focus on the differences. But nonetheless, I think Muslims and Christians, they do differ in certain areas, and those areas are very significant for Muslims as it is for Christians. So I think it's a wonderful point to have a discussion. I usually have tea or breakfast with my evangelical friends, and we have a couple hour discussions on different topics. It could be salvation, it could be Jesus, could be deity, could be crucifixion, things like that, and that's makes it up for a really interesting week. So yeah.
First of all, thanks for the question. I mean, one has to acknowledge that historically, aggressive proselytization or aggressive missionary practices have caused a lot of problems in our world, and has also caused a lot of violence and destroyed communities. The 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 claim that all truth is with me and everything that is not, everyone anyone who doesn't believe the same as I believe, must either believe like me or be destroyed, has been a really destructive historical expression of religious faith. And I think we have to recognize that. I mean, I come from the Hindu tradition, and I come from a non-proselytizing tradition. It is not that we do not have specific truth claims. I think it is how we profess those truth claims that are really important. So, for example, all three of us are sitting here at the table tonight with all of you, and we are listening to each other. We are learning from each other. This is a very important way of sharing our different commitments, the teachings of our religious tradition in a non-aggressive way, with openness to each other. I think that is very important. And I hope that all of our religious traditions can find at least um, a minimal agreement, a consensus on this one point, that when it comes to the nature of God, no one can claim fullness of understanding. It's contradictory to say that I can contain the fullness of God's truth within the scope of my finite mind or my finite understanding or my finite words. God would not be words God if God could fit into the words of my own that revolve in my own mind. So that in relation to God and in relation to our understanding of God, every tradition has to be humble. Every tradition can only profess its understanding. You spoke about humility a little while ago. But humility is a virtue. When usually we think of humility as a deep virtue in how we relate to the divine. But you spoke of the horizontal. And I think every virtue also has that horizontal measure. And that humility has to also infuse itself in how we relate to each other. So, if as a fundamental um, claim, I recognize that I can never say I know God completely and fully. It means that I have to be humble when you speak, and be open to something about the nature of God that I don't know. And that may be very important for me to hear and to learn from. So while I have problems with the aggressive missionary approaches, those approaches which are grounded in this belief that I am right and everyone else is wrong. I don't want to be in a place where religions also shut themselves off from each other. I don't want to be in a place where each religion lives in a ghetto and there is no dialogue, there is no mutual sharing, there are no conversations among different believers, because I would be impoverished by it. Right. I would be denied all the wonderful experiences and the special meaning of a figure like Jesus. If I don't hear the voice of Jesus, I've lost something, I've missed something in the ferment of religious visionaries and religious teachers.
Yeah, I believe in conversion because I was converted from non-belief and no community to wanting to see and have faith and believe and becoming a part of a community. So I believe in it. And I believe that as a Christian, of course, that Jesus is really pretty awesome, and has an ethic and a worldview, um, and is a present reality in the world that I can get strength from and guidance from spiritually, so that I can live a life that not only honors God and honors my neighbor, but brings a sense of purpose and peace and power to me and to my family. So I believe ideas matter. I believe communities matter. I believe that philosophies matter, and that on some spectrum of truth, some ideas are better than other ideas. Some are closer to truth. Some are closer to love. Uh, and so I'm hoping that my life continues to convert. That's the process of transformation, that little by little by little, I become more like my teacher, my Savior, my Lord. And in that process, I become a better bearer of the image of God. And I totally agree that the only group that Jesus was ever in their face on, or might be seen as aggressive, was his own religious leaders. So he was always kind, compassionate, and merciful to others. And so I totally reject any strong arming, violent proselytizing of any faith.
All right, I know it's getting late, but this is a really good question. So I'm going to let each of the panelists respond in just 1 or 2 minute response. And I'll paraphrase the question because it's a long one. This person is citing the theologian Christoph Stendhal, who I know nothing about. But they say that when exploring other religions, we must do several things, but one of them is to make room for holy envy, or to make room to admire something about another person's faith. So can you identify some holy envy that you have of somebody else's faith you've seen along the road, or somebody else's faith you've seen here tonight? And maybe just 1 or 2 minutes each so we can eat some cookies and talk to each other.
When I was at Sam's Club today, I saw the checkout lady, and there was a little boy, and she was like down there giving him high fives. And I don't know if she's a person of faith or not, but I was touched by her expression of getting down and loving a little boy. I'm envious of you brothers in what I know, which is not a great deal, but an openness.
Well, thank you for the person who asked the question about Christus Stendhal. I think he was a wonderful, wonderful man, and I did have the occasion many times to be in conversation with Christa before he passed away. He's really a very deep and really, really deeply spiritual person. I mean, like all Hindus, from the earliest point of contact between the Hindu tradition and the Christian tradition, I think Hindus have deep admiration for Jesus as a teacher. You call him teacher. I mean, the Hindus look to him as a guru, as a teacher. I think in him the Christian tradition has a wonderful embodiment of what the authentic spiritual religious life means, and how it expresses itself in human relationships. Hindus, in a very strange way, have developed this approach where to embrace Jesus but to reject Christianity. Institutionalized Christianity. And that's true of almost every significant Hindu thinker throughout the ages. This really embrace of Jesus, but not necessarily of the institution of the church or of the package of Christian doctrines that have gone with it. So, but I think I would have to identify Jesus in the Christian tradition as someone very special and very important to what it means for Hindus to understand the religious life.
Um, of course, Jesus is a very significant figure in Islam also. We believe that he is the Messiah, he is the Christ, but not God or God incarnate. We believe his name is actually mentioned 25 times in the Quran. And I think if you were to add up together all the verses about Jesus, about Mary, and about the story of the family of Mary and Zechariah and so on, it's probably at least a couple of hundred verses in the Quran talking about their story. So they're a very significant uh, part, and I think that's why I mentioned his name as part of the first part. So definitely Muslims believe in him and his miracles and his actions that he did. And I think I usually tell Muslims that we need to learn, which is supposed to be an Islamic practice, that we should learn from our Christian brethren and sisters about how much work they put in for the sake of God, how much work they go out try to serve the humanity, which Muslims, I mean, I really, and a lot of sermons I've used is saying that this should be really an Islamic practice, because Muslims believe that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was sent, and the Quran calls him a mercy to the universe, a mercy to the humanity and all the entire universe. So I've been telling Muslims that we should really show this mercy to the people like our Christian brothers and sisters do to show to the humanity. We should be really doing, even do more than they do to show this to the people around us about this also. So definitely, I think the other thing I like about Hindus is I think they have a lot of respect for each other. They have respect within the family, husband for the wife, and with the parents and so on, which I think it's very important to do. I think it's admirable to do.
So thank you very much to all of you. This means a lot to me, and I think this means a lot to Calvary to be a part of this important dialogue and to host these sorts of events. So thank you all for coming very much, and thank you to each of our panelists for the insights you've shared with us. And this really is a meaningful experience for me and a lot of others here, I think. So this asking for your questions was one way of helping to invite all of us into the conversation. So I hope that you stay and you take another step into the conversation and you talk to one another, and hopefully they can stay for a little bit longer to take some more of your questions. But thank you, and have some cookies and maybe some coffee or whatever else we have.